When Tsukimichi first began, the goddess seemed untouchable. A being above humans. Above kingdoms. Above the very rules of that world. And for a long time, it was impossible to imagine anyone capable of challenging her. But there's one detail that completely changed the story. Makoto. Because the further the series progresses, the more one question begins to emerge among fans. Is the final confrontation between Makoto and the goddess getting closer? And the most interesting part? Today, that question no longer sounds as impossible as it once did. In fact, every new event seems to push the two of them toward an inevitable collision. But will that conflict really happen? And if it does, is Makoto truly prepared to face someone who has ruled that world long before his arrival? At the beginning of the story, their relationship seemed simple. The goddess rejected Makoto. She looked down on his appearance. She treated his existence as something unworthy. And she cast him aside. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than an act of cruelty. But looking back, it may have been the greatest mistake she could have made. Because by pushing Makoto away, she ended up creating something she could never fully control. And that became a bigger problem with every passing arc. Because Makoto didn't disappear. He grew. A lot. And not just in terms of power. While the goddess continued watching the world from above, Makoto began building something of his own. Allies. Influence. Territory. Connections. And little by little, something unexpected emerged. A system that didn't depend on her. And that's far more dangerous than it sounds. Because for a very long time, the goddess held an absolute position. Everything revolved around her authority. But the more Makoto grows, the more he proves that it is possible to exist outside that structure. And that may be the true source of their conflict. Because this is no longer just about power. It's about independence. There comes a point when someone challenges authority. And then there comes a point when their very existence begins to question that authority. Makoto is getting closer and closer to the second one. And that creates an extremely dangerous situation. Because the goddess doesn't seem like someone who is used to being challenged. Much less ignored. But there's another important detail. Throughout the story, Makoto rarely shows any desire to confront her directly. He doesn't spend his days planning revenge. He doesn't live obsessed with the past. Most of the time, he's focused on protecting the people around him. And that's exactly what makes the situation so interesting. Because the greatest conflicts don't always happen because someone seeks them out. Sometimes they happen because they can no longer be avoided. And more than ever, it feels like Makoto and the goddess are moving in that direction. Because their interests continue to collide. The actions of one affect the other. And the greater Makoto's influence becomes, the harder it is to ignore his existence. But perhaps there's something even more important. Their difference in perspective. Because the goddess sees the world from above. As someone who has always had power. As someone who has always been in control. Makoto is the complete opposite. He understands rejection. Failure. Hardship. And because of that, both of them view the same world in completely different ways. The problem is that stories often move toward conflict when two incompatible worldviews begin competing for the same space. And that's exactly what seems to be happening here. But there's an even more important question. If this confrontation truly happens, who has more to lose? Because many fans automatically assume it would be Makoto. But is that really true? After all, the further the story progresses, the more Makoto continues to grow. He continues to evolve. He continues expanding his influence. Meanwhile, the goddess' position seems increasingly dependent on maintaining the current order. And that creates a fascinating situation. Because perhaps the real threat to her isn't Makoto's power. Perhaps it's what he represents. An alternative. A possibility. Proof that someone can thrive without depending on her. And ideas are often far harder to destroy than people. That's why when fans talk about a final battle, they may only be looking at part of the story. Because the real confrontation may not simply be between two individuals. It may be between two completely different visions of the world. On one side, an authority that has always stood above everything. On the other, someone who forged his own path without needing that authority. And when viewed from that perspective, the collision feels more inevitable than ever. So is the final confrontation between Makoto and the goddess approaching? The most honest answer is that all signs point in that direction. Because the distance between them grows smaller with every new arc. Makoto's influence continues to expand. And their interests continue to clash. Maybe the time hasn't come yet. Maybe there are still obstacles ahead. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The day Makoto and the goddess finally stand face to face may become the most important moment in the entire story of Tsukimichi. And what do you think? Do you believe the final confrontation is truly near? Or do you think the story still has surprises waiting before that meeting finally happens? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.